Welcome to the Cold Case Christianity broadcast, the only Christian case-making program hosted by a cold case homicide detective. J. Warner Wallace has been investigating cold case murders in Los Angeles County for over a decade. His work has been featured on Fox News, Court TV, and Dateline. For more information about Jim's work and the case for Christianity, please visit coldcasechristianity.com. Now, here's your host, J. Warner Wallace.
Thanks for joining me at Cold Case Christianity. I'm J. Warner Wallace. Today we're going to talk about something that may seem rather foundational, but if you've ever struggled to communicate what you believe to the people who matter to you in your life, this is an episode you're going to want to listen to and pay attention to, because today we're going to talk about why people reject a truth claim. Now, I've worked cold cases for a number of years, and I worked homicides and robberies for years prior to that. And I learned a lot along the way. And we had great success, for example, in these trials. As a matter of fact, I never lost a homicide trial in my entire career, including all the really super difficult cold case trials that we worked over the years. And 4 of these have been actually presented on Dateline. As a matter of fact, we've had more of our cases on Dateline than any other agency. And so we've had great success, and people will sometimes ask me, well, Jim, what do you attribute your success? What was the key? What is it that made you so successful? Well, I'm inclined to say, of course, the prideful side of anyone wants to say, well, I did some hard work. But that wasn't really what made us all that successful. That wasn't really the key. It wasn't so much my investigations, the nature of my investigations, the way we picked apart the evidence, the way we built a case. It wasn't so much the way that the prosecution team argued the case. It wasn't so much really even the way we used media and multimedia in both our opening statements and closing arguments to make the case. If you want to know what was really the success of our cases, where we won or lost, and we never lost our cases, I'll tell you where it was. It wasn't as part of the investigative process, although that was incredibly important. It wasn't even a part of the presentation of the case in front of a jury, although that was incredibly important. It all came down, and I bet anybody who's worked a criminal case, whether you're a prosecutor or you're a defense attorney, you'll agree with me here. It really all came down to jury selection. Cases are won or lost in that moment of time, that period of time at the very beginning of a trial when you're assessing candidates from your jury pool and trying to pick the right 12 to go in the box. It turns out if you don't pick people who are free of a presuppositional bias that would incline them against your case, you can't win. And both sides, both prosecutors and defense attorneys, spend a lot of time trying to sort through the candidates to make sure they have 12 people who don't hold such a presuppositional bias. Now, if you think that this is only important in criminal cases, you're wrong. Because if you've had difficulty sharing what you believe as a Christian with your friends who are non-believers, a lot of it may come down to jury selection. Let me try to analogize this in a way that maybe will make some sense. I want to tell you a story about 2 gentlemen whose names begin with a B, B1 and B2. Both B1 and B2 were raised in the church. They attended youth group services, things like that. Grew up in the church as part of a church body. They went off to undergraduate school where they studied biblical studies of one nature or another. B1 went to I think he got his bachelor's degree at Moody or Wheaton. Together, they went to both those institutions and eventually got a degree from Wheaton. The other B2 got his degree from another Christian institution, a Christian college. I'm trying to think what the name of it is. Let me think here. Oh, Lebanon Valley College. That's where he got his bachelor's. Both went from there and got a master's degree in the same kinds of topics, biblical studies or theology. Actually, one B1 went to got his master's degree at Princeton Seminary, and B2 also got his master's degree at. As a matter of fact, B2 also got a bachelor's in theology, a second from Princeton. Aside from that, they then went on and got PhDs at Princeton in either ancient Greek studies or languages. So both of these men ended up becoming incredible Bible scholars and teaching at universities the very topics that they themselves had mastered as both graduate and undergraduate students. Both married believing wives, and to this very day have believing wives. And interestingly, not both of these gentlemen are no longer Christians. One is, and one isn't. B1 is not a Christian anymore. As a matter of fact, he would describe himself as an agnostic, but he certainly rejects the reliability of Scripture, rejects kind of the orthodox position of Christianity, and rejects the deity of Christ. B too died about a decade ago, more than that now, almost 2 decades ago. And died, though, as a committed Christian who became an ordained pastor. What's the difference here? Of course, I'm describing 2 men whose names begin with B. One is Bart Ehrman, and one is Bruce Metzger. Bart is no longer a Christian, although he has a believing wife and has certainly studied a lot of evidence for the reliability of Scripture. Bruce, interestingly, studied the exact same sets of evidences. It's not as though Bart had access to information that Bruce didn't have. They both studied the exact same type of historical evidence, the exact same textual evidence, manuscript evidence, yet one walked away, the other stayed committed all the way until he died. What makes the difference, especially when they're both studying the exact same pieces of evidence? Clearly, if nothing else, these 2 gentlemen, these 2 men who actually wrote a book together, these 2 men came from, it's not about the evidence. It's not purely about the evidence, because they have both had the exact same exposure to the exact same evidence. There's something else that's working in the hearts and minds of these 2 men. I don't even presume to know what that would be. And I think, to be fair, somebody could say from either side, well, the other one is unduly influenced by the other things that either make him deny or accept these claims. Fine. The point I'm trying to make here is that belief is not simply about evidence, although that's a huge part of it, right? But it's also about what and why you would do something with that evidence. What are you going to do with it? And why would you take the approach you take with it? And do you hold any presuppositional bias either for or against this evidence? And this is what ends up being critical to any case you make. You might think that really the foundational thing you need in order to change someone's mind on a topic is to be able to present them better evidence, or to present them the same evidence in a better way. Not necessarily, because a lot of what's going to happen in terms of transformational changes of heart are not going to be done with just the evidence by itself. It's going to be based on whether or not this person is willing to examine his own or her own presuppositional bias. Now, I don't pretend to know what biases Bart against these claims or what biases Bruce toward these claims. I can only speak for myself, and I can tell you that for the 35 years that I was a non-believer and a pretty ardent atheist, I did hold a presuppositional bias in the sense that I was a committed philosophical naturalism. I rejected anything and any claim that anyone would make, whether biblical or otherwise, if they would try to convince me of something supernatural. I rejected Ouija boards and I rejected the Bible. I rejected anything that tried to bring some outside force aside from what I thought was purely physical, purely material, purely natural. Don't believe in ghosts, and I also didn't believe in anything supernatural. And because I'm not a ghost believer, that really inclined me out. Now, it doesn't mean I have to be a ghost believer to believe in God, because how we shape our presupposition is critical. Now, so for example, I still would say that I would only believe in those things that are immaterial, non-spatial, and atemporal if and when there is sufficient evidence to believe in such things. So whatever claim you're going to make about something that's immaterial, it can't be seen, I'm going to want to see, well, what are we basing that claim on? Now, we've talked about some of the evidences for Christianity on this show, and we'll continue to do so. But I want to just help you to realize that it's not always going to be the evidences themselves alone that make the difference. Oftentimes, most of the time, it all begins with picking the right jury. That means you're going to have to be careful about picking the right people with whom you share what you believe. Because some folks have such a presuppositional bias that no matter what you do as part of the case proper, you're never going to convince them. Also, if you're asking yourself whether or not you've evaluated a claim fairly, you're going to have to ask yourself. It's just not about trying to examine the evidence harder. At some point, you're going to have to stop and be introspective and examine your own potential presuppositional biases. Now look, when prosecutors and defense attorneys examine a jury, and try to get them ready to pick the 12 that go in the box, they don't have time to ask the jury to examine their presuppositional biases to try to remove them. In fact, what we try to do instead is just identify those people who have such biases and eliminate them. We don't have the luxury of trying to change or shape or transform their thinking at the most foundational level of their biases. But if you're going to look at a worldview and determine whether or not it's true, you may have to take some time to do that for yourself. Yes, attorneys don't have time to ask jurors to do that before they can get in the jury box. But if you're going to examine metaphysical claims, the most important claims about the nature of God, the nature of reality, I think it is worth your time to examine what is the bias you're holding that might keep you from accepting such a claim. And when we come back after the break, we'll talk about 3 different reasons people typically reject a truth claim.
Need a speaker for your next conference, retreat, training seminar, or church service? Jim travels around the country, making the case for the existence of God, the deity of Jesus, and the reliability of the Bible. He'd love to partner with you to create a powerful, transformational training experience. Just visit the Cold Case Christianity website and click the Book Me tab. You'll find everything you need to know there, including a list of Jim's speaking topics, promotional materials, Jim's speaking calendar, and a link to connect with our team so we can book your event.
Okay, now I've written about this in Cold Case Christianity. I've also written about it at the website, coldcasechristianity.com. The 3 reasons why anyone would shun a truth claim. Now, I use the word shun, S-H-U-N, for a reason. I think it kind of helps us to kind of keep in mind what these 3 reasons are. And you may be able to find more than these 3, but these are the 3 major reasons that I've experienced as I kind of deal with people. I talk to people about why they would not listen to any claim about Christianity or any other theistic system. So let me just kind of go through them with you. The first one is that sometimes we will reject a claim on what we consider to be rational grounds. We resist them rationally. Rationally. You see why I'm kind of playing on the word here. And rational rejection really comes down to people making statements. You'll hear these kinds of statements, and if they make these kinds of statements, you know this is really where their objection lies. You'll hear them say things like, I just don't think there's enough evidence for that, or I've looked at the evidence, I'm not convinced by the evidence. And I'm going to tell you, if we're really honest with ourselves, especially those who have had a change of heart on any issue, I don't care if it's on theism or any other issue, most of the time, if we're going to tell people why we reject something, we're going to say it's for rational reasons. Because why in the world would you? This is the best appearance you can offer for a rejection. If you're going to say, I don't believe you, I think you're more inclined to say, I don't believe you because I'm a reasonable, rational person, and I reject that for evidential reasons. I hear this all the time, even when, in fact, you kind of probe the reasons why they reject it, and you can see quickly they have nothing to do with reason or rationality, yet people would much prefer to say they reject something for reasonable or rational grounds than any other form of rejection, because it makes us sound, as the rejector, like we're pretty smart. I'm a reasonable person, but I reject your claim because I don't think you've got enough evidence to support your claim. Fair enough. The other, though, 2 forms of rejection I think are even more powerful and more pervasive in the people who reject a claim. The first of those 2, this is reason number 2 why anyone would reject a truth claim, is for emotional reasons. You might think you have rational reasons. Many people do. That's great. But oftentimes our objections are based not on reason, but on emotionality. And you'll sometimes hear things that can I tip your hand a little bit to what the actual reason why someone's rejecting something. People will say something like, look, my dad held that view, and he was an idiot. He always treated me poorly. I could never be that. Or I've known a lot of people who hold your view, and man, they're all jerks. And if that's what it takes, if you got to be a jerk to hold your view, I'll never hold your view. I don't want anything to do with it. Well, okay. If you probe down deep into what they're saying, they're not really making a claim that that the reasons you've offered are not logical, or that the evidence you've offered is not reasonable or persuasive. They're really saying, hey, I don't care what the evidence demonstrates. It's all about my experience with people like you. I've got an emotional reaction to that. Therefore, I'm going to reject any claim that comes from your camp because I really have an emotional resistance to anyone in your camp. Granted. I think a lot of folks are in this second category, even though they probably would never admit it. That probably, if you asked them, why do you reject that? Well, it makes no sense. You're an idiot because that just makes no sense at all. You're crazy. Well, you can kind of see just in the way we get responses from people, especially online, that can kind of tip their hand a little bit as far as what they really are rejecting for, or why they're really rejecting something. So while somebody will sometimes say that it's a rational objection, kind of read between the lines and see if that's the case. The third reason why people typically reject a truth claim is volitional. It's a matter of will. In essence, these are things that we'll sometimes say, not that anyone would probably ever verbalize it this way, but it's kind of this attitude, I don't care if it's true, whatever. I don't care. I don't care about such things to begin with, and certainly even if it was true. And you'll sometimes have to ask that question. Hey, if Christianity was true, would you be willing to accept it? If there could be evidentially proven with some form of evidence that you would accept, would you then become a Christian, a Christ follower? And if you ask the question that way, you'd be surprised how many times you get as a response that will surprise you. That will reject those. No, not really. There's no way. I mean, for a lot of people, even if it could be demonstrated evidentially with a form of evidence that they would accept, they still would not become a Christian. And of course, they would say, well, there's no way you could present a piece of evidence that I would accept. That's my whole point. If you think, well, if I said to you, look, whatever your category of evidence is, what if I could produce something? Well, you couldn't. Well, but you haven't heard me yet. I mean, I don't even know what your categories of evidence are. But just for sake of argument, pretend like whatever category of evidence you would accept, I can actually demonstrate to you, using that category of evidence, that Christianity is true. I'm not sure what that looks like yet. Just imagine, though, that whatever category you present, if you could write it out beforehand, I can follow those instructions and find something that actually demonstrated. Would you become a Christian? Well, most would say, well, no, you'd have to misunderstand my category of evidence in order to even show me something like that. There's no way. The kinds of categories of evidence that I'm thinking of, you could never demonstrate. Do you start to see what you're hearing here? What you're hearing here is that really, no matter what we show, for many people, they would rule it out of hand. They would even say that it wouldn't fit in their preconception of what categories of evidence are included to begin with. Well, that's not really about reason at that point. It's about something else that's driving the whole enterprise. Now, I never go so far. Well, I have said it, so I can't say I never say it, but I'm hesitant, let's put it that way, to make the next statement. But I think if you've worked in these areas very long, you kind of know this is true, is that most people, although they'll tell you their rejection is based on rational reasons, if you push beyond the rationality of it, you're going to see they actually hold some presuppositional bias, either against the supernatural or against any form of evidence you might try to use to demonstrate the supernatural. In any case, they hold a presupposition, and that presupposition is not based on reason. It's based on the second two categories of emotionalism or volitional resistance. And that's where I think most of us find ourselves. Although, if you were to start that way and say, hey, bud, you're not resisting for rational reasons. You're resisting for volitional or emotional reasons. Believe me, no one's going to accept that approach from you. So I think we owe it to our friends to at least respect their resistance and continue to give them good reasons to believe it's true and allow God to do the rest. Remember that this is not a matter of trying to win at every encounter. It's not all about that to begin with. There'll be lots of encounters with people who don't believe this stuff that you're not going to even bring. I mean, I'm not even going to bring it up, because in many of my interactions with my friends who are non-believers, they already know what I believe. I've had plenty of opportunities to talk about it, and I continue to do that. But not every single contact with these friends has to have me preaching the gospel, or me giving you 5 reasons why it's true, or me giving you 10 reasons why the Scripture is reliable. If you're around me long enough, you've already heard all that from me. But there's going to be lots of times when we're just going to go watch a game together. We're just going to go do the other things that friends do. Because I do think once we've made the case at some point in our relationship with people, then you're not really in a place where you have to continue to constantly... I'm looking to make small incremental changes in the way people view the world. I'm not always swinging for the fences. It's not always a home run situation. Sometimes you're just trying to get a single. Because if you get enough singles, you will drive in runs. So it's a matter of really just taking the time with people to understand which of these 3 categories are they really resisting in, and then being patient enough to work through in one of those 3 areas, because they're not always based on evidence. Just as we know with Bart and with Bruce, these 2 men, both very smart, both looking at the exact same evidence, both equally committed to the process, come to 2 completely different conclusions. Something else has got to be at work. All right, take another short break. When we come back, last segment, I just want to share with you how this might look and how it really starts to lead toward a form of circular reasoning. We'll do that right after the break.
How did they miss this?
A Huntington Beach man is behind bars tonight, accused of a murder more than 30 years ago.
We're looking for the thing that's really hiding in plain sight. Which of these things in this crime scene doesn't fit this scene? For me, this is a calling.
Yeah, I'm clearly an evidentialist. That's just my perspective as a skeptic. That was what I valued, making cases, making criminal cases. So it shouldn't surprise anybody that when I began to examine Christianity, that's the approach I took. I think what we're seeing in the church is that the greater and greater need for case making.
A man is arrested outside his home accused of having a role in the 1981 disappearance of his wife.
Carol vanished 30 years ago, leaving behind her 2 children, Mikey and Brandy.
The family would have been more than happy to believe that Carol is still out there somewhere.
If Carol was dead, if Mike killed her, taking the accusation to court would be risky. But Prosecutor Lewin decided to roll the dice. On April 13th, 2011, Mike was arrested for Carol's murder.
I've learned enough, I think, to be able to help the church do what it needs to do, to understand how evidence is processed, to understand how we put the case together, to understand how powerful the circumstantial case is, but also what we believe about the foundational views we have as Christians in a culture that is becoming more and more non-Christian. Now is the time. This is the time when we need to get serious about how to present it to a culture which is challenging what we believe more and more every day. I want to talk about why a sheer presuppositional bias against the supernatural has to be resisted a little bit in the examination of Scripture. And here's why I think it does. It seems to me, if we're reading Scripture, I'm reading it for one reason. I'm reading the New Testament for the first time when I first read it, to see if the story about Jesus was true, and to see foundationally if Jesus was what all Christians think he is, God, who can do some things that only God could do. Well, that's the thing I'm trying to investigate. I'm trying to investigate, if you think about it, the foundational claim of Christianity is that there is a God who came in the form of Jesus Christ. But how do I investigate the existence of something supernatural? By first holding a bias against anything supernatural. See, that's the problem. It'd be like entering into a crime scene with a bias against a particular kind of suspect before you even know whether or not that suspect was involved. That's not going to make the investigation any easier. It's going to make it actually harder. And I've been involved in those kinds of investigations where detectives had presuppositional biases that led us down rabbit trails we didn't need to chase because we held this bias that was preventing us from seeing clearly what really happened in the scene. Look, if in the end we're trying to examine whether or not something supernatural exists or whether something supernatural could have occurred, we cannot begin the investigation by rejecting the supernatural. Now, a good friend of mine, Frank Turek, who has become a dear brother, he's got a ministry called Cross-Examined, and you can go to crossexamined.org. Cross-Examined with a D on the end, crossexamined.org. Frank does great work all over the country. I want to pull open, last year when we were there, Frank's always great about running this thing called the Cross-Examined Instructors Academy. I've been teaching it with him for the last 2 years. And he always provides the materials of any of his presentations. I'm going to put on the screen here a graphic from one of Frank Turek's presentations about the supernatural and examining the existence of miracles to show you where the danger is in holding a presupposition such as the presupposition against anything miraculous. Here's the illustration that he often uses to demonstrate the circular reasoning really against a belief in miracles. So you can see by looking at it, here's how it starts at the top. If we're going to make a claim that miracles don't occur, and then ask the question, well, how do you know they don't occur? How do you know that? Well, because all reports of miracles are false. Well, how do you know all reports of miracles are false? Well, because we have this uniform experience against miracles. We don't experience miracle. How do you know that you haven't experienced a miracle? Well, because miracles don't occur. Do you see where we started and where we ended up? If we start off with this idea that miracles don't occur, then it turns out that anytime anything that really is impossible to explain through natural processes, we're going to find a way to try to explain it through natural processes. Even if you got, say, a healing that occurs when all doctors tell you this poor guy is as good as dead. And then of course, he's miraculously healed. And even if he's miraculously healed because his entire church comes together and lays hands on him and prays for him. And then next week he goes to the doctor and the doctor says, wow, This cancer is gone. Things like that have happened. And what's the first thing we say as naturalists? Well, he must have been improperly diagnosed. Why would you say that? Well, because miracles don't occur. You see, this is my whole point. If we start off with the bias that says that miracles don't occur, then anything that could even begin to be interpreted as a miracle, we're going to reject out of hand because of our presuppositional bias. And that's really the whole point, isn't it? So you're going to have to spend some time, and one of the ways you can get to that question, get to that presuppositional bias, when you're picking the jury to whom you're going to share the truth, is to use that question I suggested earlier. It's to simply say, hey, if you, whatever kind of evidence you would count, what would it be? I'll give you an example of this. I've often asked, what would it take today for you to believe that God exists? Well, and this isn't unusual to hear someone say something like this. Well, he'd have to come over here on this big mountain behind us, and he'd have to carve his initial. He'd have to carve a message to me in that mountain as I'm standing here, maybe with fire, and burn it into the side of the mountain and say, Jim, I do exist. You're an idiot for rejecting me all these years. Signed, Yahweh. Okay? Well, what if he did that? What if I told you, just for sake of argument, that criteria that you required, God could actually meet and did it for you right now in front of us? Would you become a theist? Would you become a believer? Would you become a Christian if he wrote it was a Christian God, Yahweh, or if he said Jesus at the end? Would you become a Christian? I've never heard anyone say, well, yeah, that would do it for me. No, they'll say this. Well, I'd have to then be examined to make sure I'm not crazy. I can't tell you how many times I've had somebody then add that caveat. Why? Well, because even if that did happen, the first thing most people would say is, I don't believe I even saw that. They'd be going, I must be going out of my mind. They begin to question their own experience. Why? Because they have that presupposition we talked about, that circular reasoning. The idea that I can't even begin to interpret what I ought to interpret as a miracle because I have such a committed bias against miracles to begin with. So, as we wrap up today's show, I just want to encourage you to understand why sometimes you may not be seeing a lot of movement in your friends after you spend a lot of time trying to explain to them why Christianity is true. It just may be that, in fact, they hold a presuppositional bias, and they won't move away from that presuppositional bias in order to accept any claim you might offer. Think about it. That is sometimes the case. There are more than one reasons why anyone would reject a truth claim. It's not always evidential. Hope that helps. Have a great week. See you back here next week on Cold Case Christianity.
Thanks for joining us at the Cold Case Christianity broadcast. If you're interested in more information about this week's topic, please visit coldcasechristianity.com. For a thorough investigation of the reliability of the New Testament Gospels and the case for Christianity, be sure to purchase Cold Case Christianity. A homicide detective investigates the claims of the Gospels. It's available wherever books are sold.